Kierkegaard, famous Danish philosopher, the, I always get this confused, 19th century, tells this story in his book, Fear and Trembling, about a man who loved the story that we heard read of Abraham and Isaac, the sacrificing of Isaac. He loved it from a child, but as he grows, he finds that he loves the story even more. But a strange thing happens. He understands it less and less. So let's look at this story a little bit. There are a few stories recalled by as many people as often as this story is. Muslims, Jews, Christians throughout the world, this is an important story for all of us. Our Jewish neighbors see Isaac often as the main character. They call this story the Akeda, or the binding. And they believe that Isaac willingly embraced what Abraham was doing. That's the way they understand it. According to our Muslim neighbors, it's not Isaac, but Ishmael, who's actually sacrificed by, or almost sacrificed by Abraham, and they trace their spiritual lineage, as it were, through Ishmael. And Christian interpreters regularly have seen Jesus mirrored or prefigured or predicted or something in this story. It's a very familiar story, but sometimes I think our familiarity with this story hides to us how wildly strange it is. So imagine Bob. I hope is there any Bobs in the room? Okay, if there's any Bobs on air or on the room, this is not you, this is another Bob, a fictional Bob we're talking about. Imagine Bob is a good Christian. He's faithful when asked, has penetrating spiritual insights, and he does much to help the poor. He's a good man. And now imagine our friend Bob coming to church one day and saying that he's going to kill his oldest child because God told him to. Now, what would be your first reaction? Would it be, I wish I had faith like Bob's? Or would it be to call the RCMP immediately? Probably the latter. This is a disturbing story, and because we don't like being disturbed, we interpret it in ways that this becomes a nice little story about obeying God, for example. That's one interpretation that's been very popular. But I ask, is this really a good story to use when we want to think about what obedience to God looks like? Does obeying God ever entail doing what is destructive and wrong? During the Nuremberg trials, for those who don't know, were the trials that addressed the atrocities of the Nazis during relating to the Holocaust. But during those trials, accused Nazis regularly defended themselves by saying, well, we were doing what we were told. We were obeying orders. Obeying God certainly cannot be like that. Obedience to a higher authority, even if it is God, does not shield us from the consequences of our actions. So if this is not a story best understood as being about obedience, is it one perhaps about loving God above all things? It's often understood in those terms. I taught in Barbados for 3 years, and I remember having this one class where we were talking about this story, and there was a young woman there, a young mother at this, and she shared with the class that when she read this story, she felt that it spoke to her about, it was like a warning about not loving her son too much. You know, you love yourself so much, but you should never let your love of your children eclipse love of God. And if you do, if you ever love your children like that, then God might come along and ask you to give up what you love the most to demonstrate that you love God most. I told her that I believe that this reading, while I understood it, was wildly incorrect, and that God wanted her to love her child as madly and as crazily as she had it in her to do. God is not the enemy of love, certainly not the love of parents to children. So if it's not about loving God above all else, and it's not about obedience, what are we to do with this wild and dangerous story? Now, there's never going to be any final interpretations. These kinds of stories are stories that we are meant to wrestle with for the whole of our lives. They're not a story that you're going to come up with a simple answer and you can check off your little list and move on to the next story. We carry these with us. So I'm not going to offer you anything like a final story today. Kierkegaard, in the book I mentioned at the beginning, argues in the course of his book that the way he understands this story is that while God is never immoral, never evil, there is a way of thinking, of being, that transcends simple morality. That's the way he parsed this out. Some scholars of religion have argued that in ancient times, perhaps before the recorded history, Israelites, the tribe of people that formed this body of literature, participated in child sacrifice, and that this was a story that was basically saying, no, we don't sacrifice children, we're now going to sacrifice animals. And so it's a way of saying no to this practice. And those are all fine, but I prefer a little bit more of a literary approach, so that's what I'm going to offer you today. And again, this is not meant as the final approach or final understanding, but I do think it gives us something important to think about as we face the 21st century together. So a little bit of background remembrance about the story of Abraham. Abraham promises God, amongst other things, he promises God land, and he promises Abraham, got to get my subject and object fixed out. God promises Abraham descendants, importantly, a child, and that these descendants will grow into a great people. So that's the premise of the story of Abraham. But as in every good story, there's always tension, and the tension comes from threats or problems or obstacles. So what are the threats or obstacles in this story? Well, for one, Abraham and Sarah are very old. They're not fertile anymore. They've gone beyond that. And so that's a big threat. That's a big problem with this story. There's some tension there. How is this going to be resolved? This couple cannot have children anymore. How are they going to have a promised son that's going to become a great people? There's other threats. Another threat, for example, there's others beyond this, but another big one comes from Abraham himself, his fear of others. So they're wandering around, and according to the story, Sarah is a beautiful, beautiful woman, and Abraham's really, really worried that because of her beauty, the leaders of the nation are going to kill him and take her as his wife. And so what he does is he gets her to agree to say that she's his sister. And that way Abraham won't be threatened. But it doesn't really do much to protect Sarah as she's taken off and almost raped or whatever. And that, of course, would threaten the promise. God steps in and saves the day. On 2 occasions that actually happens. So we have at least 2 threats to the promise. One is just the circumstances, the age of the couple. Another threat comes from Abraham himself, the person to whom the promise was made. And now we have the climax of the story, and what is the third threat of the promise? It comes strangely and surprisingly from God himself. So God himself becomes the threat of the fulfillment of the promise. The greatest threat, perhaps. So God threatens the promise by asking Abraham to kill his promised son. So the word here is God, which comes from the Hebrew word Elohim. Now, Elohim is kind of a generic word for God. Just means God. The nations called their, at least according to the Hebrews, called their gods Elohim. Right? So it's just sort of a generic name. It's God. So what happens to this story if we take a little bit of an imaginative leap and imagine that Elohim in this story represents what we might think of as the God of religion. Now, God and religion sometimes go together, sometimes they're partners, but sometimes they're stridently opposed to each other. Sometimes, in fact, I'd say religion is God's biggest opponent. The entity on the planet that stands the most stridently against the ways of God. Sometimes we imagine a God according to our own desires and fears and whatever that is so vastly different from the God who actually is, that God becomes an enemy of the God who actually is. And I wish I could say this is a rare thing, that it only happens every now and then, but unfortunately, it happens a lot. Sometimes in the name of God, religion builds residential schools, slaughters children, and commits cultural genocide. Sometimes in the name of God, religion empowers and participates in the colonial rape and desecration of lands and peoples. In the name of God, religion takes our children, the promise of our future, the hope of our land, and offers them on the altar of divine duty. In the name of religion, Abraham comes to the very verge, to the very edge of destroying God's plan. But at the last moment, he's stopped. And what stops him? It's interesting, if you look in the Hebrew, it's not Elohim. It's not God, the generic God. It's not Elohim, but rather we are told the angel of the Lord, or in Hebrew, it's angel of Yahweh. The angel of Yahweh is actually just a way of, it's a personification of God. It's actually God himself. Yahweh is the name of the covenant, the name of relationship, the name of a spiritual connection. And it's that entity, that being, that puts a stop to what Elohim has started. Yahweh saves Yahweh's own plan of life and goodness from Elohim, the God of religion, and its destructive path and plan of death. God steps in, Yahweh steps in at the last minute and saves Abraham from the religion that operates in the divine name but has gone astray. Now, again, I'm not offering you that as a final explanation of this story, but just as something to think about, because I believe the way I've rendered it is something that's helpful for us to think about as church in the 21st century. As faithful Anglicans, as faithful Christians, I think it's important to be aware that our beloved tradition, our beloved ways of being in the world do not automatically operate in the service of Yahweh, in the service of good. Wish it were so, but unfortunately that's just not the way it is. Goodness is never something that's automatic for us two-legged ones. Evil always is a possibility. And using religion in the name of evil is always a possibility. That's always at our hands. And if we forget that, then we're probably more likely to actually fall into the danger of that. And it's scary because we can use our holiness and the goodness and the virtue and the rightness of our cause as a pretext for harm. Sometimes our self-righteousness can be as dangerous as a loaded gun. So how do you avoid that? I think to avoid it, there's probably no surefire way of avoiding it, but I think there's two keys to trying to avoid that. Is, first of all, embracing the Spirit of God in the depths of our being. Embracing the Spirit of God, which the writers in the New Testament tell us is gentleness, kindness, love, mercy. That's what God is like. Embracing that image of God with all our being. And the other piece is community. Sometimes we can help each other stay on the right path. Neither of those by themselves might be enough. Even together we might go astray, but we need to fight for the good. We can't just assume it's going to come our way. We need to fight to become agents of the good. We can't just assume that our mere presence is going to do anything for anybody. So my prayer is that we as a parish, as a diocese, as a national church, will be quick to hear and embrace and live into the love of God through the Spirit. And may we always be ready to resist the force of religion, our own especially, if ever they become servants of death. May we be led into the path of life by the kind Spirit of God, and may it be ever so. Amen.